September the 12th, 1683. The sun rose over Vienna to reveal a sight that would have seemed impossible just months before. The massive Ottoman army that had surrounded the city for 2 months, the army that had brought the mightiest empire in the world to the gates of Christian Europe, was in full retreat. Behind them lay 140,000 dead and wounded, abandoned siege works stretching for miles, and the shattered dreams of Sultan Mehmed IV. This was not supposed to happen. The Ottoman Empire in 1683 was at the absolute peak of its power, controlling territory spanning 3 continents, fielding armies that dwarfed anything Europe could muster, and led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a military genius who had never lost a major campaign. The Siege of Vienna was meant to be the culmination of 200 years of Ottoman expansion into Europe, the final blow that would shatter Christian resistance and open the path to Rome itself. Instead, it became the high-water mark of Islamic expansion into Europe, the point where centuries of seemingly unstoppable conquest ground to a halt against the walls of a single city. This is the story of how 15,000 defenders held out against an army 10 times their size, how a desperate relief force arrived in the nick of time, and how one of the most significant battles in human history determined the fate of European civilization. But to understand the Siege of Vienna, we need to understand how the Ottoman Empire reached this moment, and why Vienna mattered so much to both sides. The Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe had begun in earnest in the 14th century. Under Sultan Mehmed II, Constantinople fell in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire and establishing the Ottomans as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. By 1529, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had led the first Ottoman siege of Vienna, which failed primarily due to logistical problems and the early arrival of winter. For the next 150 years, the Habsburgs of Austria and the Ottoman Empire engaged in nearly constant warfare along the Hungarian frontier. The Ottomans made steady gains, conquering most of Hungary and establishing a buffer zone of tributary states. By the 1680s, the strategic situation favoured another push toward Vienna. The Holy Roman Empire was distracted by conflicts with France. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was dealing with internal troubles. The Venetians were focused on their Mediterranean territories. Most importantly, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha had convinced Sultan Mehmed IV that the time was right for a final decisive blow against the Habsburgs. Kara Mustafa was not merely a military commander. He was effectively the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, with the Sultan increasingly removed from day-to-day governance. Born into slavery and raised in the Ottoman court system, Mustafa had risen through a combination of political acumen and military success. By 1683, he commanded absolute authority over the largest and most professional military force in the world. The army he assembled for the Vienna campaign was staggering in scope. Contemporary estimates, which modern historians largely accept, place the Ottoman force at between 150,000 and 200,000 men. This included approximately 40,000 to 60,000 janissaries, the elite slave soldier infantry that formed the core of Ottoman military power. The janissaries were not merely soldiers but a warrior caste, trained from childhood in military arts, fanatically loyal to the Sultan, and equipped with the best weapons available. Supporting the janissaries were Sipahi cavalry, feudal horsemen who formed the backbone of Ottoman tactical mobility. Approximately 50,000 Sipahi accompanied the campaign, their role to raid surrounding territories, cut supply lines, and prevent relief forces from reaching Vienna. Beyond the regular army came the vassals and allies. Crimean Tatars, perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 strong, served as light cavalry and raiders. Moldavian and Wallachian contingents added another 10,000 men. Hungarian rebels under Imre Thököly, who sought Ottoman support against Habsburg rule, contributed around 10,000 fighters. The artillery train alone was unprecedented. Over 300 cannon of various sizes, from massive siege guns firing stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds to lighter field pieces for tactical support. Moving this artillery required thousands of oxen and horses, with the logistics train stretching for dozens of miles. The Ottoman plan was methodical and on paper unstoppable. The army would march from Istanbul in spring, moving up through the Balkans and into Hungary. They would besiege and capture key fortresses along the route, securing their supply lines. By midsummer, they would arrive at Vienna with overwhelming force, besiege the city, and compel its surrender through a combination of bombardment, mining, and assault. Once Vienna fell, the Habsburg domains would be defenceless. Austria proper, Bavaria, and potentially the German states beyond would lie open to conquest. The psychological impact would be devastating. The Holy Roman Emperor would likely sue for peace on humiliating terms, ceding huge territories to Ottoman control. The balance of power in Europe would shift permanently in favour of the Islamic Empire. Emperor Leopold I of Austria understood the threat perfectly. By March 1683, Ottoman intentions were clear. Leopold faced an impossible choice. Vienna, while heavily fortified, was not prepared for a siege of the scale the Ottomans could deliver. The garrison was too small, the walls needed repair, and food stocks were insufficient for a lengthy siege. Leopold could either remain in Vienna and risk being captured when the city fell, or he could evacuate and work to assemble a relief force. On July 7, 1683, Leopold made his decision. He would leave Vienna, taking with him the imperial court, treasury, and most of the mobile military forces. Command of the city's defence would fall to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a 43-year-old professional soldier with extensive experience fighting the Ottomans. Starhemberg was given an impossible task: hold Vienna with whatever forces remained until a relief army could be assembled and marched to the rescue. He was given no timeline for when relief might arrive, no guarantee that it would arrive at all, and explicit orders that surrender was not an option. The city must hold or die trying. The garrison Starhemberg commanded numbered approximately 11,000 regular soldiers and 5,000 armed civilians and militia. Against an Ottoman army of 150,000 plus, these numbers seemed laughable. But Starhemberg had several advantages that would prove crucial. First, Vienna's fortifications, while not perfect, were formidable. The city was surrounded by massive walls up to 20 feet thick in places, reinforced with earth-filled bastions designed to absorb artillery fire. A second inner wall provided defence in depth. The glacis, the cleared ground in front of the walls, gave defenders clear fields of fire against approaching enemies. Second, the civilian population, approximately 60,000 people, were committed to the defence. Vienna's citizens understood perfectly well what Ottoman conquest meant. They had heard the stories from cities that fell to the Ottomans: mass enslavement, particularly of women and children, execution of military-age males, plunder and destruction. The alternative to successful defence was not merely political defeat, but personal catastrophe for every person in the city. Third, and perhaps most important, time was on Vienna's side. The Ottomans had to capture the city before winter arrived. The campaigning season in Central Europe effectively ended in October, when rain turned roads to mud and cold weather made large-scale military operations difficult. If Vienna could hold until late September or October, the Ottomans would have to lift the siege or risk being trapped in hostile territory as winter approached. Starhemberg's strategy was therefore simple in concept if brutally difficult in execution. Trade space for time, defend the outer works as long as possible but abandon them when they became untenable. Fall back to the main walls, hold the walls at all costs, conserve ammunition and manpower, make every Ottoman advance cost them dearly in blood and time, wait for relief. The Ottoman army appeared before Vienna on July 14, 1683. The sight must have been terrifying for the city's defenders. As far as the eye could see, Ottoman tents covered the landscape. The Sultan's personal tent, a massive structure of silk and gold, sat on high ground overlooking the city. Around it, the tents of the Janissaries, Sipahi and vassal forces created a city of canvas housing nearly 200,000 men. The artillery park alone covered acres of ground, with hundreds of cannon being positioned for the bombardment. Kara Mustafa sent a formal surrender demand to the city. The terms were standard for Ottoman sieges. Immediate surrender would result in the garrison being allowed to leave with their weapons, and the civilian population being spared. Each day of resistance would result in harsher terms when the city inevitably fell. Starhemberg's response was equally standard. A single cannon shot fired from the walls in the direction of the Ottoman camp. There would be no surrender. The bombardment began on July 17th. Over 130 Ottoman cannon opened fire simultaneously, a sound that witnesses described as continuous thunder that could be heard 30 miles away. The barrage concentrated on the Berg Bastion and Lobel Bastion, the strong points covering the southwestern corner of the city's defences. Ottoman gunners knew their craft. Rather than trying to knock down the massive walls directly, they targeted the earthworks and parapets, seeking to create breaches that assault troops could exploit. The walls of Vienna began to crumble under the onslaught. Each cannonball, some weighing over 300 pounds, smashed into stone and earth, throwing up clouds of dust and debris. Defenders working to repair damage were caught in the open and torn apart by the impact. At night, the bombardment continued by the light of fires that burned throughout the city, started by red-hot shot specifically designed to ignite buildings. But bombardment alone would not take Vienna. The real threat came from beneath the ground. Ottoman military engineers were masters of siege mining, the art of tunnelling under fortifications to plant explosive charges that would collapse walls and bastions. Starting in late July, Ottoman sappers began digging approach trenches toward Vienna's walls. These zigzagging trenches, called saps, allowed workers to advance under cover toward the fortifications. Once close enough, they would begin tunnelling directly under the walls. The mining war was fought in near-total darkness, in tunnels barely large enough for a man to crawl through, with both sides racing to outdo the other. Ottoman miners dug toward the walls. Viennese countermines dug to intercept them. When the tunnels met, brutal hand-to-hand combat erupted in spaces too small to swing a sword, fought with knives, pistols, and bare hands. The Ottomans had the advantage in mining warfare due to their extensive experience and large numbers of skilled sappers. But the Viennese had two advantages of their own. First, they knew their own ground intimately and could predict where Ottoman mines would emerge. Second, they were defending, meaning they could establish listening posts and detect tunnelling before Ottoman sappers reached the walls. By early August, the pattern of the siege had settled into a brutal routine. Ottoman artillery would pound the walls all day, Ottoman miners would dig toward the fortifications, Ottoman infantry would probe for weaknesses, testing the defences and forcing the garrison to spread their limited manpower thin. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg rotated his troops to maximise their effectiveness. Soldiers would serve 24-hour shifts on the walls, then rest for 12 hours before returning. The civilian population worked constantly to repair damage, carry ammunition, tend the wounded, and maintain the infrastructure of defence. Food was rationed strictly. Water supplies had to be guarded constantly as Ottoman infiltrators attempted to poison wells and cut aqueducts. Disease began to spread in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses killed as many defenders as enemy action in the early weeks of the siege. The first major crisis came on August 6th, when Ottoman sappers successfully detonated a mine under the Berg bastion. The explosion was massive, throwing tons of earth and stone into the air and creating a breach 50 feet wide in the city's outer defences. Janissaries immediately stormed the gap, seeking to exploit the breach before defenders could react. The fighting that followed was savage. Starhemberg personally led the counterattack, rallying defenders who were reeling from the shock of the explosion. Hand-to-hand combat raged in the breach for 6 hours. Ottoman troops fought with the fanaticism of men who believed death in battle meant immediate entry to paradise. Viennese defenders fought with the desperation of men protecting their homes and families. When the Ottomans finally withdrew, they left over 1,000 dead in the breach. Viennese casualties were nearly as severe, and the breach remained open, a gaping wound in the city's defences that required constant guard. Over the next several weeks, the pattern repeated. Ottoman mines exploded, creating breaches. Ottoman troops assaulted. Viennese defenders counterattacked and sealed the gaps with earthworks and palisades. Each cycle cost both sides heavily, but the mathematics favoured the attackers. The Ottomans could afford losses of thousands. Vienna's garrison was bleeding to death through attrition. By late August, Starhemberg had lost nearly 4,000 men killed and wounded, more than a third of his original force. The civilian militia was taking up more and more of the defensive burden as regular soldiers fell. Food stocks were running critically low despite strict rationing. Ammunition consumption exceeded supply, forcing defenders to recover cannonballs fired by the Ottomans and fire them back. Morale was beginning to crack. Defenders could see the endless sea of Ottoman tents surrounding the city. They could hear the constant bombardment, watch their comrades die daily and wonder if relief would ever come. Starhemberg sent increasingly desperate messages out of the city via courier, letters smuggled through Ottoman lines at night by riders who faced almost certain death if caught. The messages all said the same thing. Vienna could not hold much longer. Relief must come soon, or the city would fall. Emperor Leopold, operating from Passau with what remained of the Austrian court, was working frantically to assemble that relief force. But the political situation was extraordinarily complex. The Holy Roman Empire was not a unified state, but a loose confederation of territories, each with its own ruler and interests. Convincing these various princes and dukes to contribute troops required extensive negotiation and promises of future reward. Leopold's greatest hope lay with Poland. King Jan Sobieski of Poland was one of Europe's most successful military commanders, having defeated Ottoman armies in multiple previous campaigns. If Sobieski would bring the Polish army to Vienna's relief, there was a chance of victory. But Poland and Austria had been rivals for decades. Sobieski had no obligation to risk his army saving the Habsburg capital. Months of diplomatic negotiation followed. Leopold offered territorial concessions, trading rights, and a military alliance. He played on Christian unity, arguing that all of Europe was threatened by Ottoman expansion. He warned that if Vienna fell, Poland would be the next target. Finally, in August 1683, Sobieski agreed. Poland would send an army to relieve Vienna. The relief force that began assembling in late August was impressive but hardly overwhelming. Sobieski brought approximately 18,000 Polish troops, including the famed Polish winged hussars, heavy cavalry considered the finest shock troops in Europe. The Saxons contributed 8,000 men under Duke Johann Georg III. Bavaria sent 11,000 soldiers. Various German princes added another 10,000. Charles of Lorraine, commanding the Austrian forces that had evacuated with Leopold, brought 11,000 men. The total relief army numbered approximately 68,000 to 70,000 men. They would be facing an Ottoman army more than twice their size, but they had several crucial advantages. First, the Ottomans were committed to the siege and had dispersed their forces around Vienna's perimeter. They could not easily concentrate to face a relief army. Second, the relief force would be fresh, not exhausted by months of siege operations. Third, and most important, they would have the element of surprise regarding timing and direction of attack. The relief army's march toward Vienna was a logistical miracle, moving 70,000 men through mountainous terrain, coordinating columns from multiple kingdoms, maintaining supply, all while Ottoman scouts tracked their movements and reported back to Kara Mustafa. The army had to traverse the Vienna woods, densely forested mountains on Vienna's western approaches. Ottoman forces held the direct routes, so the relief army had to take a circuitous path through difficult terrain. Sobieski, given overall command of the relief force, understood that speed was critical. Every day of delay meant Vienna was closer to falling. Polish scouts brought increasingly desperate reports. The city's defences were collapsing. Ottoman troops had breached the inner walls in several places. Hand-to-hand fighting was occurring in Vienna's streets. The siege could not last more than a few more days. Inside Vienna, the situation had become catastrophic. By September the 8th, Ottoman troops had captured significant portions of the outer defences and were assaulting the inner walls at multiple points. Entire sections of the fortifications were held by nothing more than hastily erected barricades manned by exhausted defenders. The Berg bastion, which had been under continuous attack for weeks, was more crater than fortification. Its defenders, reduced to less than 200 effective soldiers and militia, were holding ruins against continuous assault. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. The garrison was down to a few days of bread and hardtack. Horses and other animals had been slaughtered for meat. Disease was rampant, with hundreds dying daily from typhus and dysentery, in addition to combat casualties. Starenberg's war diary from September 8th contains a stark entry. The enemy is in the counterscarp. We are lost unless relief arrives immediately. On September 9th, Ottoman sappers detonated their largest mine yet under the Lobel bastion. The explosion could be felt throughout the city and was heard by the approaching relief army 20 miles away. The breach was enormous, over 100 feet wide, and created a ramp of rubble leading directly into Vienna's inner defences. 8,000 Janissaries immediately launched an assault, determined to break into the city before defenders could react. The fighting that followed was the most desperate of the entire siege. Every available defender, including Starhemberg himself, rushed to the breach. Citizens armed with nothing more than axes and clubs joined soldiers firing muskets and pikes. Women and children carried ammunition and water, tended the wounded, and helped repair barricades. The battle raged for 14 hours. Ottoman troops gained footholds inside the breach multiple times, only to be driven back by counterattacks. Bodies piled so high in the gap that they formed obstacles to further attack. By nightfall, the Ottomans withdrew, leaving over 2,000 dead. Viennese losses were proportionally even worse, with nearly 1,000 defenders killed. Starhemberg knew the city could not survive another assault of that magnitude. His garrison was down to fewer than 4,000 effectives. Ammunition stocks were nearly depleted. The civilians were at the breaking point of exhaustion and despair. That night, September 9th into 10th, he prepared a final message to send to Emperor Leopold. It stated simply that Vienna would fall within 24 to 48 hours unless relief arrived. He had no way of knowing that the relief army was less than a day's march away. Kara Mustafa was aware of the approaching relief force. His scouts had been tracking their movements through the Vienna woods for days. But he made a fatal miscalculation. He believed he could capture Vienna before the relief army arrived, and that once the city fell, the relief force would lose its purpose and disperse. He was so confident of imminent victory that he did not withdraw troops from the siege lines to prepare defensive positions against the relief force. Instead, he ordered an all-out assault for September 11th, determined to smash through Vienna's defences once and for all. Over 40,000 Ottoman troops were committed to the attack, the largest single assault of the entire siege. Every breach, every weak point in Vienna's defences would be hit simultaneously, in an effort to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The assault began at dawn on September 11th with a bombardment more intense than anything previously experienced. Every Ottoman cannon fired simultaneously for 2 hours. Then the infantry advanced. Janissaries in their distinctive uniforms, Sipahi cavalry dismounted to fight on foot. Vassal troops pressed into service. They came forward in waves, screaming battle cries and firing muskets. The defenders, manning walls and barricades, fought with the energy of pure desperation. They knew relief was close. Deserters and prisoners had been spreading rumours that a massive army was approaching. All they had to do was hold for one more day. But holding seemed impossible. Ottoman troops breached the defences at multiple points. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted throughout the fortifications. In some sections, defenders were pushed back into the city streets, fighting house to house as janissaries pressed forward. By mid-afternoon on September 11th, the situation was critical. The Ottomans held significant portions of Vienna's inner defences. Starhemberg had committed his last reserves. There was nothing left. If the Ottomans launched one more major push, the city would fall. And then, from the Vienna woods to the west, came the sight that would save the city and change European history. The relief army had arrived. On the heights above Vienna, the standards of Poland, Austria, Bavaria, and Saxony appeared, with sunlight glinting off the armour and weapons of 70,000 soldiers formed in battle array. The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. For Vienna's defenders, it was as if God himself had sent deliverance. Men who had been ready to collapse from exhaustion suddenly found new energy. Citizens who had been preparing for the worst began to hope again. For the Ottoman troops, the effect was the opposite. They had been told that no relief force was coming, that Vienna's allies had abandoned her. Now they saw that they would be fighting not just exhausted defenders, but a fresh army larger than their own effective force. Kara Mustafa immediately recognised his mistake. He should have lifted the siege days ago and prepared to face the relief force from fortified positions. Instead, his army was dispersed, exhausted from months of siege operations, and completely unprepared for a major battle. The Battle of Vienna on September 12, 1683, was one of the decisive encounters in world history. King Jan Sobieski, commanding the relief force, had spent September 11th positioning his army on the heights of the Vienna woods overlooking the Ottoman positions. His plan was straightforward. The left wing, commanded by Charles of Lorraine with the Austrian and German troops, would attack the Ottoman right flank. The centre, under the Saxons and Bavarians, would engage the Ottoman centre. The right wing, Sobieski's Poles, would descend from the heights and smash into the Ottoman left. The battle would be decided by shock and speed, hitting the Ottomans before they could properly form defensive lines. The attack began at 4 a.m. on September 12th. The left wing advanced first, engaging Ottoman forces that were still in siege positions around Vienna's walls. The fighting was fierce, but the Austrians and Germans had the advantage of momentum. They pushed forward steadily, rolling up the Ottoman positions. The centre engaged next, with Saxon and Bavarian infantry advancing in tight formations against increasingly desperate Ottoman resistance. Kara Mustafa tried frantically to organise his forces, but his army was scattered. Units committed to the siege couldn't be withdrawn quickly. Troops facing the relief force were outnumbered at each point of contact. By mid-morning, the Ottoman position was deteriorating rapidly. Their right flank was collapsing under Austrian pressure. The centre was being pushed back. And then came the decisive blow. At approximately 5 p.m, after 13 hours of fighting, Sobieski led the largest cavalry charge in history. 20,000 Polish, Austrian and German cavalry, including 3,000 of Poland's legendary winged hussars, charged down from the heights directly at the Ottoman left flank. The sight must have been absolutely terrifying for the Ottoman troops. Thousands of heavily armoured horsemen moving in perfect formation, with the Polish hussars' distinctive wings creating a roaring sound as they advanced, thundering toward them at full gallop. The impact was catastrophic. The Ottoman left simply disintegrated. Units facing the charge broke and ran. The panic spread. Within an hour, the entire Ottoman line was in retreat, and retreat turned to rout. The Janissaries, professional soldiers to the end, tried to form rearguard positions to cover the withdrawal. They were swept aside by the charging cavalry. Sipahi cavalry attempted to counterattack. They were outnumbered and overwhelmed. By nightfall on September 12th, the Ottoman army was in full flight. Kara Mustafa had lost control of his forces entirely. Units were abandoning their positions and fleeing south toward Hungary as fast as they could move. The siege camp, which had been home to nearly 200,000 men for 2 months, was abandoned. Tents, supplies, artillery, even the Sultan's personal effects were left behind in the mad rush to escape. The pursuing cavalry cut down thousands of fleeing soldiers. The casualties were staggering. Modern estimates suggest the Ottomans lost between 10,000 and 15,000 killed on September the 12th alone, with another 5,000 captured. Total Ottoman losses for the entire siege, including combat casualties, disease and the final battle, exceeded 50,000 dead and 30,000 wounded. An army of 150,000 to 200,000 had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The relief army's losses were remarkably light. Perhaps 2,000 killed in the final battle, with another 5,000 wounded. Vienna's garrison had lost approximately 12,000 killed and wounded over the course of the siege, with another 8,000 civilians dead from combat, disease and starvation. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Vienna's survivors poured out of the city to greet their rescuers. The scenes were emotional beyond description. Soldiers and civilians who had thought themselves doomed hours before were now saved. Families searched frantically for missing loved ones. The wounded filled every available building. The city itself was in ruins. Entire sections of the fortifications had been reduced to rubble. Buildings were burned out shells. The streets were filled with debris and the bodies of those who had died in the final assaults. But Vienna had held, and the Ottomans had been defeated. The political and strategic consequences unfolded over the following months and years. Kara Mustafa, retreating back to Ottoman territory, was held responsible for the disaster. On December 25, 1683, on orders from Sultan Mehmed IV, he was executed by strangulation with a silk cord, the traditional method for high-ranking Ottoman officials. His severed head was sent to the Sultan as proof of his death. The execution of Kara Mustafa marked the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's decline. Never again would the empire seriously threaten Central Europe. The psychological impact of the Vienna defeat rippled through Ottoman society. An army that was supposed to be invincible had been destroyed. The myth of Ottoman military supremacy was shattered. For Europe, the Battle of Vienna marked the turning point from defence to offence against the Ottomans. Within months, Austria formed the Holy League with Poland and Venice to drive the Ottomans out of Europe. Over the next 16 years, the Great Turkish War saw the Habsburgs reconquer Hungary and push deep into Ottoman Balkans. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formalised these gains, with the Ottomans ceding huge territories to Austria. The Ottoman Empire would continue to exist for another 220 years, but it would never again threaten to conquer Europe. The high water mark had been reached at the walls of Vienna and broken there. The military lessons of the siege were profound. It demonstrated that even the largest, most professional army could be defeated if the defenders were determined and willing to pay the cost. Vienna's garrison, outnumbered more than 10 to 1, held long enough for relief to arrive through courage, competent leadership, and the active support of the civilian population. It showed the importance of fortifications and defensive preparation. Vienna's walls, despite being somewhat outdated by 1683 standards, proved adequate to delay the Ottoman assault long enough for strategic circumstances to change. It revealed the vulnerabilities of pre-modern logistics. The Ottoman army, for all its size and power, could not sustain a major siege indefinitely. Disease, supply problems, and the need to disperse forces for foraging all undermined combat effectiveness. It demonstrated that cooperation between European powers, despite their many differences, could produce effective military results. The relief force was an ad hoc coalition of multiple nations with no formal alliance structure, yet it functioned well enough to win a decisive victory. The cultural impact of the Battle of Vienna lasted for centuries. In Catholic Europe, it was celebrated as a divine intervention, with September 12th becoming a feast day honouring the deliverance of Vienna. The story was told and retold as an example of Christian unity against external threats. Polish culture in particular celebrated Sobieski's role. The king who had led the charge that saved Vienna became a national hero, with his image appearing in countless paintings, poems, and historical accounts. The famous Sobieski portrait showing him in full armour became an iconic image of Polish military prowess. In Ottoman culture, the defeat at Vienna became a symbol of decline. Later Ottoman historians would point to 1683 as the moment when the empire's trajectory changed from expansion to contraction. The psychological impact on Ottoman military culture was significant. An army that had believed itself invincible had been proven mortal. The legacy of the siege appeared in unexpected places. Coffee, for example, became widespread in Vienna after the battle. According to legend, a Polish spy named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, who had infiltrated Ottoman lines during the siege, was rewarded with bags of coffee beans left behind by the fleeing army. He opened Vienna's first coffee house, beginning the city's famous coffee culture. Whether this story is literally true is debated by historians, but there's no doubt that coffee consumption in Central Europe increased dramatically after 1683, partly due to the large quantities captured from the Ottoman camp. The croissant, that quintessentially French pastry, is said to have been created in Vienna after the siege to commemorate the victory. Shaped like the crescent moon of the Ottoman flag, it symbolized the defeat of the enemy. Again, the literal truth is uncertain, but the story illustrates how deeply the Battle of Vienna penetrated European cultural memory. For military historians, the siege and battle represent a watershed moment in the evolution of warfare. It was one of the last major sieges conducted using primarily pre-gunpowder era techniques of mining and assault. Within decades, improvements in artillery and the development of more sophisticated fortification systems would change siege warfare fundamentally. It demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of heavy cavalry in the age of gunpowder weapons. Sobieski's charge was successful, partly because Ottoman troops, exhausted and demoralized, could not maintain cohesion against shock cavalry. Within a century, improvements in infantry firearms and tactics would make such charges increasingly suicidal. It showed the limits of numerical superiority without logistical and strategic coherence. The Ottoman army was larger, better equipped, and more experienced than the relief force. But it lost because it was in the wrong position at the wrong time, committed to a siege it could neither complete nor abandon quickly. The human cost of the siege is difficult to fully comprehend. Vienna had a pre-siege population of approximately 75,000, including the garrison. By September 13th, that number had been reduced to around 55,000. 20,000 people, more than a quarter of the city's population, had died in less than 2 months. Every family had lost someone, every building bore scars. The psychological trauma affected survivors for the rest of their lives. Children who lived through the siege grew up with memories of constant bombardment, starvation, and the fear that each day might be their last. For the Ottoman soldiers, many of whom were slaves or conscripts, the siege and subsequent rout meant death far from home in a foreign land. Tens of thousands of men from Anatolia, the Balkans, the Crimea, never returned home. Their families received no news, no closure, just the absence of husbands, fathers, and sons who had marched away with the Sultan's army and disappeared into the void of war. The defence of Vienna was not just a military operation, but a total mobilization of society. Women served as ammunition carriers, messengers, and nurses. They maintained essential services, operated bakeries and kitchens, and cared for the wounded. Contemporary accounts record multiple instances of women taking up weapons when men fell, defending breaches and fighting alongside the garrison. Children served as couriers within the city, their small size allowing them to move quickly through rubble and damaged buildings. They helped repair fortifications, carried water, and assisted the wounded. Many were killed performing these tasks. Priests and monks served not just as spiritual support but as frontline medics, and, when necessary, combatants. The Catholic Church turned monasteries and churches into hospitals, with monks and nuns tending the sick and wounded. Some put aside their religious vows to take up weapons and defend the walls. The city's guilds organised their members into militia units, with carpenters, blacksmiths, and merchants fighting alongside professional soldiers. These civilians received minimal military training but fought with the desperation of men defending their homes and livelihoods. Starhemberg's leadership was crucial to the successful defence. A military commander facing impossible odds might have surrendered to save his men. A politician might have sought accommodation with the Ottomans. Starhemberg did neither. He maintained discipline when morale crumbled, led counterattacks when defeat seemed certain, and never wavered in his determination to hold the city. His post-siege reports to Emperor Leopold were models of military professionalism, detailing what worked, what failed, and what lessons should be learned. He received relatively little reward for his achievement. While Sobieski was celebrated as the saviour of Vienna, Starhemberg, whose defence had made that salvation possible, received less recognition. He continued his military career, fighting in subsequent campaigns against the Ottomans, but never achieved the fame of more flamboyant commanders. His true monument was Vienna itself, which survived because he refused to let it fall. The Battle of Vienna influenced military thinking for generations. Prussian military theorists studied it as an example of how fortifications and defensive depth could delay superior forces. Napoleon reportedly studied accounts of the siege when planning his own campaigns. The concept that a determined defence could hold out long enough for strategic circumstances to change influenced defensive planning into the 20th century. The battle also influenced political philosophy. The successful cooperation between European powers to face a common threat became a model for later alliances. The idea that shared civilization and values could overcome national rivalries influenced the development of concepts like European unity and collective security. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Vienna transformed into a symbol of resistance. The city that had nearly fallen became a rallying point for European identity. Habsburg propagandists emphasized that Vienna had stood as a bulwark against Eastern invasion, protecting Western civilization itself. This narrative, while self-serving, contained significant truth. If Vienna had fallen, the strategic situation would have changed dramatically in the Ottomans' favour. Austrian territories would have been indefensible. The German states beyond would have faced immediate threat. The balance of power might have shifted enough to fundamentally alter European development. The political reorganisation of Central Europe following the Ottoman defeat had long-lasting consequences. Austria emerged as the dominant power in the region, a status it would maintain until the 20th century. Hungary, reconquered from the Ottomans in subsequent campaigns, came under Habsburg control. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, while celebrating Sobieski's victory, actually declined in relative power as Austria and Russia rose. The balance of power that emerged from the Vienna campaign and subsequent wars shaped European politics for 200 years. The cultural flowering of Vienna in subsequent centuries, its development as a centre of music, art and philosophy, was only possible because the city survived 1683. The Vienna that produced Mozart, Beethoven and Freud, that became synonymous with classical music and café culture, existed because 15,000 defenders held the walls long enough for relief to arrive. The alternative history, where Vienna fell to the Ottomans, would have produced a very different European civilization. The technological lessons learned from the siege influenced military engineering throughout Europe. The effectiveness of Vienna's bastioned fortifications, despite their age, led to renewed investment in starfort designs. Military engineers studied how Vienna's defenders had used countermining, and these techniques were refined and taught in military academies. The vulnerability of besieging armies to relief forces became a central concern in siege planning. Future commanders would be far more cautious about committing to lengthy sieges without adequate forces to both maintain the siege and defend against potential relief armies. The Ottoman retreat from Vienna was chaotic and brutal. The army that had marched north in confident expectation of victory straggled back to Ottoman territory in complete disorder. Discipline collapsed. Units abandoned their positions and fled independently. The artillery, which had taken months to transport north, was left behind almost entirely. Of the 300-plus cannon that had bombarded Vienna, fewer than 50 made it back to Ottoman territory. The rest were captured by pursuing Allied forces or abandoned in the retreat. The treasure that Kara Mustafa had brought to finance the campaign, including the Sultan's personal wealth intended for the victory celebration, was captured almost entirely. Contemporary estimates placed the value at over 5 million guilders, an enormous sum that enriched the Austrian treasury and helped finance subsequent campaigns. More valuable than gold were the Ottoman military records captured in the camp. These documents revealed Ottoman strategic planning, force disposition, and logistical capabilities. Habsburg intelligence officers studied these papers extensively, gaining insights that would prove invaluable in subsequent conflicts. The human tide of refugees fleeing south with the defeated Ottoman army created a humanitarian catastrophe. Ottoman soldiers, many wounded, struggled through hostile territory without supplies. Hungarian and Croatian forces, emboldened by the Ottoman defeat, attacked stragglers mercilessly. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers died in the retreat, killed not in battle, but through exhaustion, disease, and attacks by local populations seeking revenge for years of Ottoman occupation. The vassal forces suffered particularly badly. Crimean Tatars, who had served as light cavalry and raiders, were cut off from the main retreat and hunted down. Moldavian and Wallachian contingents were blamed for the defeat despite their relatively minor role and suffered accordingly. Hungarian rebels under Imre Thököly, who had allied with the Ottomans against the Habsburgs, found themselves abandoned. Those captured by Austrian forces faced execution for treason. Thököly himself fled to Ottoman territory, where he lived in exile, his dream of an independent Hungary crushed at Vienna's walls. The prisoner exchange following the battle revealed the scale of human suffering on both sides. Thousands of Christian slaves captured in previous Ottoman campaigns and forced to serve in the siege were liberated from the Ottoman camp. These men, women, and children, some of whom had been captives for years, returned to communities that had long given them up for dead. Their accounts of life in Ottoman captivity reinforced European perceptions of the conflict as a civilizational struggle. Conversely, Ottoman prisoners captured during the battle and retreat faced uncertain fates. Some were ransomed back to Ottoman authorities in exchanges that took years to negotiate. Others remained in captivity, forced into labor or military service for their captors. Many simply disappeared into the chaos of post-battle Europe, their ultimate fate unknown. The strategic exploitation of the Vienna victory happened swiftly. Charles of Lorraine, commanding Austrian forces, did not allow the Ottomans time to reorganize. Within weeks of the battle, Austrian armies were pushing south, liberating Hungarian territories that had been under Ottoman control for generations. The cities of Esztergom and Visegrad were recaptured before winter halted the campaign. The following spring saw the creation of the Holy League, a formal alliance of Austria, Poland, Venice, and eventually Russia, dedicated to driving the Ottomans out of Europe. Pope Innocent XI blessed the alliance, framing it as a crusade, though the participants were motivated as much by territorial ambition as religious fervour. The campaigns of 1684 through 1699 saw the greatest territorial losses in Ottoman history. Buda, the historic capital of Hungary, fell to Austrian siege in 1686 after 145 years of Ottoman rule. Belgrade was captured in 1688, though later retaken by the Ottomans. The entire Great Hungarian Plain was cleared of Ottoman forces by 1690. Venice, taking advantage of Ottoman weakness, conquered the Peloponnese and Greece. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1690, which ended the Great Turkish War, formalized these losses. The Ottomans ceded almost all of Hungary and Transylvania to Austria, much of the Peloponnese and Dalmatia to Venice, and Podolia to Poland. The treaty marked the first time in Ottoman history that the empire had signed a peace treaty from a position of weakness, ceding territory without compensation. The psychological impact was devastating. For 300 years, the Ottoman Empire had expanded continuously. Now it was contracting. The narrative of inevitable Ottoman conquest, which had driven recruitment and maintained morale, was shattered. internal questions began to surface about Ottoman military and political systems that had seemed invincible just years before. Sultan Mehmed IV, who had reigned during the defeat at Vienna, was deposed in 1687, blamed for the military disasters that had befallen the empire. His successor, Suleiman II, attempted military reforms, but lacked the resources and time to implement them effectively. The Janissaries, once the elite force that made Ottoman armies invincible, had become a conservative faction resistant to change. They had performed poorly at Vienna, and their political power prevented the kind of military modernization that might have reversed Ottoman decline. The Sipahi system, which had provided cavalry forces, was breaking down as the economic basis of the feudal grants collapsed. New military technologies and tactics emerging in Europe were not being adopted quickly enough in Ottoman armies. The historiography of the Battle of Vienna evolved significantly over centuries. Contemporary accounts on both sides were heavily propagandistic. Christian sources portrayed it as a divine intervention and a triumph of faith over heresy. Ottoman sources, constrained by political considerations, blamed individual commanders rather than systemic problems. 19th century European historians, influenced by nationalism and romanticism, emphasized the heroism of individual leaders, particularly Sobieski. Vienna was portrayed as the moment when European civilization was saved from Eastern barbarism, a narrative that fit contemporary prejudices but oversimplified the complex reality. 20th century historians, with access to more sources and less influenced by religious or nationalist fervour, developed more nuanced interpretations. They emphasized logistical and strategic factors over individual heroism. They noted that Ottoman defeat was not inevitable, but resulted from specific decisions and circumstances that might have been different. Modern historians have further complicated the narrative. They note that the Ottoman Empire was not some alien Oriental despotism, but a sophisticated multinational state with its own rich cultural and intellectual traditions. The conflict was not simply West versus East, but a geopolitical struggle between empires with different, but not incompatible civilizations. They emphasize the role of disease, logistics, and economics, rather than focusing solely on battles and heroic charges. They note that many of the soldiers on both sides were conscripts or slaves who had little personal stake in the conflict's outcome, but paid the ultimate price nonetheless. Archaeological work at the siege sites around Vienna has revealed the material reality behind historical accounts. Excavations have uncovered siege works, mine tunnels, and mass graves containing the remains of those killed in the fighting. Analysis of skeletal remains shows evidence of malnutrition, disease, and traumatic injuries consistent with siege warfare. Personal items found in these graves, religious medallions, pipes, buttons, coins, provide poignant reminders of the individuals behind the historical statistics. The battlefield archaeology has also refined understanding of specific aspects of the siege. The location and extent of Ottoman siege works can now be mapped precisely. The effectiveness of Vienna's countermining operations has been confirmed through discovery of countermine tunnels that successfully intercepted Ottoman saps. The density of cannonball impacts on surviving sections of Vienna's walls demonstrates the intensity of the bombardment. Physical evidence supports historical accounts that described continuous artillery fire for weeks at a time. The preservation of portions of Vienna's fortifications as historical monuments has allowed military historians to study 17th century siege warfare techniques in detail. Walking the surviving walls, one can see the bastions that Starhemberg's men defended, the angles of fire that made certain positions more defensible than others, and the logical pattern of the Ottoman assault strategy. These physical remains make the human experience more tangible than any historical document. The commemoration of the Battle of Vienna took different forms in different cultures. In Austria, September 12th became a day of thanksgiving, with religious services held annually at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. Monuments were erected to key figures, including Starhemberg and Sobieski. The rooms in the Hofburg Palace where Leopold had made the decision to evacuate became places of pilgrimage for those interested in the city's history. In Poland, Sobieski's role was celebrated as proof of Polish military prowess and the nation's importance in European affairs. Paintings of the charge at Kahlenberg, the heights from which Sobieski descended, became iconic images in Polish national consciousness. When Poland lost its independence in the late 18th century partitions, the memory of Vienna became even more important as a symbol of past glory. In Hungary, the memory was more complex. The The siege marked the beginning of the end of Ottoman rule, but it also meant the replacement of one foreign overlord, the Ottomans, with another, the Habsburgs. Hungarian nationalists in later centuries had mixed feelings about celebrating a victory that led to centuries of Austrian domination. The strategic importance of Vienna itself in 1683 cannot be overstated. The city was not just the Habsburg capital, but a major trade centre connecting northern and southern Europe. Its location on the Danube made it a crucial transportation hub. Control of Vienna meant control of the river traffic between Germany and the Black Sea. The loss of Vienna would have severed communication between the Austrian hereditary lands and the Holy Roman Empire proper. The Habsburg dynasty derived much of its power from its control of Austria and its status as Holy Roman emperors. Losing Vienna would have jeopardized both. The city's fall might have led to the fragmentation of the Habsburg domains and the elevation of a different dynasty to imperial status. The economic consequences of Vienna's survival were significant. The city remained a major market for goods from across Europe. Its merchants, who had suffered devastating losses during the siege, rebuilt their businesses and helped maintain the trade networks that connected the continent. Vienna's survival allowed the development of the Austrian Empire as an economic as well as political power in Central Europe. The demographic recovery of Vienna took decades. The population, reduced from 75,000 to 55,000 during the siege, did not return to pre-siege levels until the early 18th century. Many survivors left the city, traumatized by their experiences and unwilling to risk another siege. Immigrants were encouraged to settle with offers of tax breaks and property grants. These new Viennese came from across the Habsburg domains, bringing different languages, religions, and cultural practices. The city that emerged from the siege was in some ways more cosmopolitan than the one that had entered it. The physical reconstruction was extensive. Entire neighbourhoods that had burned during the bombardment were rebuilt, often with improved street layouts and more substantial buildings. The fortifications were repaired and strengthened, incorporating lessons learned during the siege. Vienna became a model of modern defensive architecture, with improved bastions, better fields of fire, and more sophisticated countermine systems. The cultural renaissance that followed Vienna's survival produced some of European civilization's greatest achievements. The Baroque architecture that defines Vienna today, the palaces and churches that make it one of the world's most beautiful cities, was built largely in the decades following 1683. This construction boom was partly triumphalist expression, celebrating survival and victory. The development of Vienna as a musical centre, culminating in the classical period of Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven, occurred because the city had survived to become a stable political capital, attracting talent from across Europe. The coffeehouse culture, the philosophical and scientific discussions that characterized Enlightenment Vienna, the development of psychoanalysis in the late 19th century, all of these cultural achievements rested on the foundation of the city's survival in 1683. The military careers of those who fought at Vienna continued long after the battle. Starhemberg remained in Austrian military service, fighting in subsequent campaigns against both the Ottomans and France. He died in 1701, having served the Habsburg dynasty for over 40 years. His descendants remained prominent in Austrian military and political circles for centuries. Sobieski returned to Poland as a hero but faced increasing political difficulties. His remaining years were marked by conflicts with the Polish nobility and unsuccessful military ventures. He died in 1696, his dream of strengthening the Polish monarchy unrealized. Ironically, the victory at Vienna, his greatest triumph, did little to solve Poland's fundamental political problems. Charles of Lorraine, who had commanded the relief army's left wing, went on to win major victories in the subsequent war against the Ottomans. He was instrumental in the capture of Buda and Belgrade. His military success helped restore Habsburg prestige and made possible the territorial expansion that followed. He died in 1690 at age 59, worn out by years of continuous campaigning. The individual stories of common soldiers and civilians who experienced the siege were mostly lost to history. A few accounts survive, providing glimpses of what ordinary people endured. A baker named Hans Zeitler kept a diary recording daily life in the besieged city. His entries describe the gradual reduction of rations, the constant fear of bombardment, the growing desperation as relief failed to arrive. His final entry, dated September 11th, expressed certainty that the city would fall the next day. He survived the siege and his bakery remained in operation, serving the same neighbourhood for another 150 years. A student at the University of Vienna named Georg Rimpler wrote letters to his family describing the siege from a young man's perspective. He described the excitement that turned to fear as the siege progressed, the death of friends in the bombardment, the mixture of terror and exhilaration during the final battle. He survived and eventually became a priest, never forgetting what he witnessed during those 2 months. An Ottoman janissary named Mehmed, whose account was recorded by a Christian captive who later escaped, described the growing frustration as the siege dragged on. The expected easy victory had turned into a grinding attrition that cost thousands of lives with no end in sight. His account of the final battle emphasized the shock and fear when the relief army appeared, the collapse of Ottoman morale, and the chaotic retreat. Whether he survived is unknown. The environmental impact of the siege was severe and long-lasting. The area around Vienna was stripped of vegetation as both armies foraged for firewood and construction materials for siege works. Forests were cut down to provide timber for Ottoman trenches and Viennese defensive works. The bombardment and mining operations created a landscape of craters and rubble that took decades to restore. Water supplies were contaminated by decomposing bodies and military waste. The Danube and its tributaries around Vienna remained polluted for years after the siege. Fish populations collapsed. The surrounding farmland was devastated. Fields were torn up by trench digging, crops were destroyed or confiscated by both armies, and the population of livestock was decimated. The agricultural recovery took several growing seasons, during which food had to be imported from distant regions at great cost. The disease legacy of the siege extended well beyond its immediate participants. Typhus, dysentery and other illnesses that had ravaged the besieged city and besieging army spread through the region as soldiers and refugees dispersed. Epidemic disease killed tens of thousands in the months following the battle, adding to the direct combat casualties. Medical knowledge in 1683 was primitive by modern standards. Physicians did not understand disease transmission or the importance of sanitation. Treatment was based on ancient theories of humours and bleeding that often did more harm than good. The crowded, unsanitary conditions in besieged Vienna created perfect conditions for disease spread, which military medicine was powerless to prevent. The wounded suffered terribly with limited anaesthesia and crude surgical techniques. Amputation was the standard treatment for serious limb injuries, performed without proper pain control or antiseptic procedures. The survival rate for major wounds was low, with infection killing many who survived the initial injury. The hospitals that treated Vienna's wounded were overwhelmed, with patients crowded into churches and public buildings that lacked basic facilities. The financial cost of the siege and subsequent war was staggering. Austria, already heavily indebted, borrowed massive sums to finance military operations. These debts took decades to repay and shaped Habsburg fiscal policy well into the 18th century. The Ottoman Empire faced similar financial pressures. The loss of loot that Kara Mustafa had expected to bring back from Vienna meant that the campaign represented pure cost, with no compensating gain. The subsequent territorial losses deprived the empire of tax revenue from productive regions. Poland's participation in the relief of Vienna cost the treasury dearly. Sobieski's army had to be paid, equipped, and supplied for the march to Vienna and the subsequent campaign. The expense contributed to Poland's fiscal problems that would ultimately undermine its independence. The smaller German states that contributed to the relief force faced proportionally even greater costs relative to their resources. These expenses were justified politically as necessary for collective security, but they strained economies that were not wealthy to begin with. The intelligence and espionage aspects of the Vienna campaign remained somewhat mysterious due to the nature of the evidence. Both sides ran extensive spy networks attempting to learn enemy plans and capabilities. The Ottomans had intelligence agents in Vienna before the siege who reported on fortifications, garrison strength, and food supplies. Some of these spies were discovered and executed during the siege, but others clearly operated successfully throughout. The Habsburgs had their own network of agents in Ottoman territory and among the vassal states. Information from these sources helped Leopold understand Ottoman intentions and plan accordingly. The courier system that maintained communication between besieged Vienna and the outside world was remarkable. Riders had to slip through Ottoman lines at night, navigating by moonlight and avoiding patrols. Many were captured and killed, but enough succeeded to keep information flowing. The messages they carried were often in code, simple substitution ciphers that provided some security if captured. The Polish spy Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, mentioned earlier in connection with coffee, actually did perform intelligence work during the campaign. His knowledge of Turkish language and customs allowed him to move through Ottoman lines gathering information about force dispositions and morale. Whether his role was as dramatic as later legends suggest is debatable, but he clearly provided valuable intelligence. The religious dimension of the conflict, while not the only factor, was significant for participants on both sides. For Christian Europeans, the siege was framed as a defense of Christendom against Islamic invasion. Churches across Catholic Europe held special masses praying for Vienna's deliverance. Pope Innocent XI declared the defense of Vienna a crusade, offering spiritual rewards to those who fought. For Ottoman soldiers, jihad, holy war in defense and expansion of Islamic territories, provided motivation and legitimized the campaign. The concept of martyrdom, dying in battle against infidels as a path to paradise, was emphasized in Ottoman military culture. These religious frameworks should not be dismissed as mere propaganda. For many participants, genuine religious conviction was a primary motivator. They believed they were fighting for their faith, not just their state or emperor. At the same time, strategic and economic factors were clearly also important. Both sides wanted control of territory, resources, and trade routes. Religion provided justification and motivation, but was not the sole cause of the conflict. The treatment of prisoners and captured populations reflected the brutal realities of 17th century warfare. Ottoman policy toward conquered cities was relatively consistent. Cities that surrendered quickly faced relatively mild treatment, with the population allowed to remain under new administration. Cities that resisted, particularly those that resisted after formal surrender demands, faced harsher treatment, including enslavement of much of the population. Vienna's resistance meant that if the city had fallen, the population would have faced mass enslavement. Contemporary Ottoman practice involved selection of young boys for the Janissary Corps, young women for harems and domestic service, and able-bodied men for labour. The elderly and infirm were often simply killed as economically unviable. Christian treatment of Muslim prisoners was similarly harsh. Those captured were often held for ransom if they appeared wealthy enough that someone might pay. Those without such prospects faced enslavement or execution. The concept of prisoners of war rights did not exist in the modern sense. Captives were property to be exploited or disposed of as captors saw fit. The evolution of Ottoman strategy after Vienna showed initial resistance to accepting the new reality. For several years after 1683, Ottoman military planning continued to assume that the situation could be restored through renewed offensives. The failure of these counterattacks gradually forced acceptance that the strategic balance had shifted permanently. The internal Ottoman debate about what went wrong produced several competing narratives. Some blamed individual commanders, particularly Kara Mustafa, for tactical and strategic errors. Others pointed to systemic problems with the military system. A few prescient observers recognized that European military technology and organization were advancing while Ottoman methods had stagnated. The reform efforts that emerged from this analysis were too little and too late. By the time the Ottoman Empire attempted serious military modernization in the 18th century, the gap with European powers had widened considerably. The institutional resistance to change, particularly from the Janissaries who saw reform as threatening their privileges, prevented effective adaptation. The Habsburg response to victory was expansionist and opportunistic. Austria used the momentum from Vienna to position itself as Central Europe's dominant power. The territorial gains from the Ottomans were consolidated and integrated into the Habsburg domains. New administrative systems were imposed on reconquered Hungary, bringing it firmly under Austrian control. The empire that emerged from the Great Turkish War was significantly larger and more powerful than before. This expansion created its own problems. Managing the multinational empire with its German, Hungarian, Czech, Croatian, Italian and other populations proved increasingly difficult. Nationalist movements that would eventually tear the empire apart in the 20th century had their roots in the territorial arrangements established after 1683. The technological and tactical lessons from Vienna influenced military development throughout Europe. The effectiveness of fortifications in delaying superior forces led to continued investment in fortress construction and siege engineering. Military academies established courses in fortification design and siegecraft based partly on analysis of the Vienna campaign. The importance of artillery was reinforced, leading to continued development of cannon technology. European artillery would become increasingly sophisticated over the following century, widening the technological gap with the Ottomans. The coordination of the relief army, bringing together forces from multiple nations to fight under unified command, became a model for coalition warfare. The precedent of European powers cooperating against common threats influenced diplomatic and military planning for generations. The impact on civilian populations throughout the region extended far beyond Vienna itself. The areas of Hungary and Austria through which the Ottoman army had marched suffered devastation from foraging and violence. The retreat was even worse, with the defeated army desperate and angry, taking out their frustration on civilian populations. Villages were burned, inhabitants killed or enslaved, and crops destroyed. The recovery took years. The demographic shifts caused by the war were significant. Ottoman rule in Hungary had brought Muslim settlers, Turkish administrators, and others who now fled or were expelled as Habsburg forces advanced. Christian populations that had lived under Ottoman rule for generations suddenly found themselves under new rulers with different languages, religions, and administrative systems. The adjustment was often difficult and sometimes violent. Population movements created refugee crises. Tens of thousands of people were displaced, forced to flee their homes as armies advanced and retreated. These refugees, struggling to survive without resources or support, added to the humanitarian catastrophe. Many died from exposure, disease, or starvation. Those who survived often found their former homes destroyed or occupied by others. The long-term consequences of the Battle of Vienna for European development are difficult to calculate precisely, but were clearly significant. If Vienna had fallen and the Ottomans had continued their advance, the entire trajectory of European history would have changed. The Habsburg Empire might have collapsed or been reduced to a minor power. The balance of power that maintained relative stability in Central Europe for 2 centuries would have been different. The cultural and intellectual developments that emerged from Vienna, contributions to music, philosophy, science, and art, might never have occurred or might have occurred elsewhere under different circumstances. Conversely, Ottoman control of Central Europe might have facilitated different forms of cultural exchange and development. Ottoman civilization was sophisticated and advanced in many ways. An alternate history where Ottoman power extended further into Europe might have produced interesting cultural synthesis. But such speculation can only go so far. What actually happened was that Vienna held, the Ottomans were defeated, and European civilization developed along the path that victory made possible. The legacy of September 12, 1683, shaped the world we inherited. The battle demonstrated that determined resistance could overcome overwhelming force, that cooperation could triumph over division, and that the course of history could turn on the courage of individuals willing to stand when surrender seemed rational. These lessons resonated far beyond the immediate military context. They influenced how Europeans thought about their own identity and their place in the world. The memory of Vienna, when the city stood against impossible odds and survived, became part of European historical consciousness in ways that shaped attitudes and decisions for centuries. Today, Vienna is a modern European capital, cosmopolitan and prosperous, its past as a besieged fortress city remembered but not defining its present. The walls that Starhemberg defended were mostly torn down in the 19th century to make way for the Ringstrasse, the grand boulevard that circles the inner city. Yet traces remain. Plaques mark where bastions once stood. Museums preserve weapons and artifacts from the siege. St. Stephen's Cathedral, which sheltered refugees and wounded during the siege, still dominates the city skyline as it did in 1683. For historians, Vienna 1683 remains an endlessly fascinating subject, one of those rare moments when the stakes were clear, the outcome uncertain, and the consequences profound. It was not the largest battle in history, not the bloodiest, not the most technologically advanced, but it was decisive in ways that reverberate through time. The Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe, which had seemed unstoppable for 300 years, ended at Vienna's walls. The defenders who held those walls for 2 months, who endured bombardment, disease, starvation, and constant assault, who fought when every rational calculation said they should surrender, They changed history through sheer determination, and when King Jan Sobieski led 20,000 cavalry down from the heights of Kahlenberg in the largest charge in history, crashing into the Ottoman lines with thunderous impact, he delivered the blow that broke Ottoman power forever. In the end, the Siege of Vienna was not decided by who had the largest army or the most cannon or the best fortifications, though all of these mattered. It was decided by will, the will of Vienna's defenders to endure unendurable suffering, the will of Europe's leaders to put aside rivalries and cooperate, the will of thousands of soldiers to march to the rescue of a distant city in the face of a vastly superior enemy. That will, that refusal to accept inevitable defeat, made all the difference. On September 12, 1683, at the gates of Vienna, the Ottoman Empire's centuries-long advance into Europe finally stopped, not because it had to, but because ordinary people refused to let it continue.